Chapter 2. I'd come to the conclusion that sending me to the office was Ms. Khan's only joy in life, that made me responsible for her happiness in a way, but I tried to slip into class without her noticing. I was only a minute late this time, and I had a really good reason. She pointed toward the front office before I could drop into my chair. When I got back into the room with my tardy pass, Ms. Khan said to my interpreter, Mr. Charles, "Tell Iris to move over next to Nina so she can catch her up." She usually talked around me like that. Mr. Charles had told her so many times that she could just talk to me, and he would interpret the message instead of always saying, "Tell Iris." Finally, he gave up reminding her she was never going to get it. Also, I didn't need help catching up, and I sure didn't want it from Nina. "I'll catch myself up," I signed, when Mr. Charles voiced that for Ms. Khan, her face turned even meaner than usual, which I hadn't thought was possible. She didn't say anything else, just jerked a pointing finger to the space next to Nina's desk. The plan made sense to Ms. Khan because she thought Nina was the smartest person in the class, and Nina thought she knew sign language. She checked out a library book about it, so that made her an expert. Some people have the kind of confidence that lets them get away with being clueless. Nina signed something to me as I slid my desk over to her territory. I asked Mr. Charles, did she just call herself a giant squirrel? He clamped his lips together and looked away while answering, "I think she meant great partner." That was what I figured, but trying to make Mr. Charles laugh was one of my favorite things. I leaned over to the next row to look at Clarissa's gold book. Mr. Charles interpreted my question when I asked Clarissa what we were working on. Nina tried to barge in with her flapping hands and made up sign language. When I ignored her, she got dangerously close to my face, as if I couldn't see her. My eyes stayed on Mr. Charles, since he actually did know what he was doing. Nina's hands were like a swarm of flies I wanted to swat away, so it felt good to flick the wrist of an open hand to sign, "Stop it," to her. After Mr. Charles interpreted that, he added that it might be distracting to have two people signing at the same time. Usually he didn't jump in like that because he wanted me to take care of things for myself, so Nina must have been annoying him too. After a few minutes, Ms. Khan came by to ask Nina, "Are you doing okay helping Iris?" "Yes, I think she's catching on," she answered. Catching on? I looked back down at my work so I wouldn't turn into one of those cartoon characters with steam shooting out of their ears. After I scribbled down the last answer in my workbook, I slammed it closed and signed, "Finished." I was about to take out my phone so I could read the new issue of Antique Radio magazine I downloaded that morning. If I open a book on my desk, I could probably read some of the magazine by looking down at the phone on my lap. While my hand was sliding into my backpack, Ms. Khan said something to me and pointed at her mouth. She tried that before, as if that would magically help. Help me understand her. One night at dinner, I told my parents, "Hey, I'm not deaf anymore." Ms. Khan pointed to her lips while she talked, and everything was perfectly clear. "Can't believe you didn't think of it." On the first day of school, Ms. Khan tried to hold Mr. Charles' hands still to force me to read her lips instead of watching his signing. I didn't catch what Mr. Charles said to her, but she let go of his hands like she'd touched a hot stove and didn't try that ever again. We ignored the lip pointing, and Mr. Charles interpreted what Ms. Khan said. I'd have to redo my poetry assignment from last week. That didn't make sense. The poem I'd turned in was really good. When Ms. Khan returned with my paper, she looked like she'd just bitten into a sour pickle, a normal expression for her. But right then, it looked like she was smelling something really bad at the same time she was biting that pickle. The red ink was the first thing I noticed when Ms. Khan handed back my paper. In the margin were the words, "This does not rhyme," which wasn't true. The poem came from a sign language storytelling game I used to do with Grandpa. One of us would start a story, and we'd take turns adding to it, one sign at a time. The trick was our hands had to keep the same shape for the whole story. Like, if we started out with a closed fist, every sign for the rest of the story had to be made with a fist, too. We'd go on and on like that until one of us couldn't think of something to add without breaking the hand-shape rule. My favorite story started with a tree full of leaves. A leaf blew away with a gust of wind and landed in a river, floated down a stream and onto the bank. It ended with a bird swooping in to grab the leaf to add to her nest in another tree. We told that story with our hands open like the number 5 the whole way through. It didn't look the same on paper. Paper is flat, so I couldn't use all the space above and below and around it that I needed to tell the story right. And the words in English don't have the same shapes as they do in sign language. But here's how it looked when I wrote it down. Leaves waving, blowing, twirling, floating current, land on the riverbank. Mother bird grabs the leaf and builds a new nest. Sure, it didn't rhyme the way English words do, but I thought maybe it would be okay to turn in if I explained all that. At the top of the paper, I'd written a note about the poem. I wondered if Ms. Khan had even read that part. A red line crossed through the poem, ruining it. I took out my own red pen and glared at Ms. Khan. Below her, "This does not rhyme" message, I wrote, "It does to me." Ever since Grandpa died, I wondered if he could still see me, if he was with me in some way. Right then, I hoped more than anything that he was nowhere near me. I didn't want him to see what Miss Khan had done to our story, to us. Everyone turned and looked at me as I crumpled the paper into a ball. Nina held a finger to her lips, as always, like it was her job to remind me that things made noise and that I wasn't supposed to do any of them. But I did not throw the paper at her face. I flung it across the room, where it landed in the trash can, followed by the tree and the leaves and the river and the bird with her new nest, all slashed to pieces by a red line.